Welcome to the Futurebuild podcast, your go-to source for exploring the innovations and challenges shaping the built environment. Today, we're honoured to have Nuno Correia, Head of Sustainability at WilkinsonEyre. WilkinsonEyre are celebrating 40 years of pioneering architectural design, and they're renowned for its sustainable and innovative projects, including the Battersea Power Station, HS2's Old Oak Common, City Tower and 8 Bishopsgate. Nuno's unique journey from civil engineering to architecture has positioned him at the intersection between these two disciplines, driving sustainability through collaboration and creative problem solving. Together, we'll explore how WilkinsonEyre's core values, their groundbreaking projects, and Nuno's expertise are shaping a more sustainable future for the built environment. Nuno, amazing to have you on the podcast. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. We always like to start these off by really sort of getting under the skin of yourself, talking a little bit about your background and what led you into the built environment, and in particular the field of sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, I was always interested in buildings and architecture, and that's what got me into civil engineering in the first place. But in that degree, I had the opportunity of studying a semester abroad in Technical University of Delft, and that's where I had the opportunity to start looking into things like bioclimatic design, sort of more advanced building physics, and that really sparked my interest in sustainability. And then further along the line, I decided to do a master's in environmental design at UCL, and that really threw me into the deep end of sustainability sort of industry. So much of my work in that sector so far has been in early stage sort of environmental design guidance and collaboration with architects. So it makes a lot of sense that I'm actually working for an architect studio now.
And tell us a little bit about that transition. Was that an easy transition, going from sort of civil engineering into obviously the building services and the energy management side of things, but then into the world of architecture?
Yeah, I think it was quite gradual, but I think it was natural in the way that I was always interested in that sort of zone between architecture and engineering where, collaboration is needed, where there's a little bit of translation sometimes, and a little bit of kind of trying to understand what the other side is trying to convey and what ideas they're bringing forwards. So I was always interested in that area where you can really sort of deliver integrated design.
And I talked about this in the intro, but you're head of sustainability at WilkinsonEyre, which is a practice that's been going for over 40 years and probably worked on some of the most landmark buildings that we have. Tell us a little bit about maybe the sustainability approach that you have as a practice, and it'd be interesting sort of maybe how you've shaped that in recent years as well.
Yeah, well, just last year we were celebrating the 40 years of the practice, and it was quite interesting to have the models for 40 of our most significant projects side by side and see the difference in scale. But also then start to see how different themes kind of connect together, how the early work in long-span structures and super sheds, how that connects to the work in Stratford Station and Bus Depot, and how that then influences a lot of other things, such as Magma and other projects that we've worked on a few years ago. And then you see sort of parallels between the work done in the glass houses at Kew and how that was then scaled up to things like Gardens by the Bay. And you also then see kind of transformation and retrofit as being a theme that kind of spans across the practices portfolio. So, I mean, as we reflect on that, there's always been themes of material efficiency and a sort of a desire for lightness and a desire for, achieving the objective with as less material as we can and being really efficient in that, which connects to what we're trying to do nowadays with reducing embodied carbon. There's always been an aspiration to design low energy buildings, which you can trace all the way back to things like Stratford, where there's a plan that kind of brings air in to naturally ventilate the whole volume. And then you see themes around sort of biophilia, biodiversity, connection to nature, which sort of permeate across the portfolio as well. So what we're trying to do is kind of continuing those themes and constantly evolve them and bring more of them together on every single project. So our approach becomes, consistent across all of those themes.
WilkinsonEyre has been a practice that's probably been synonymous with combining that sort of good design with amazing innovation and then sustainability at the heart as well. So you've got quite a big role as being head of sustainability. It's quite a legacy to carry on.
Yeah, I think it helps that there's a strong ethos of bridging art and science. It's a sentence that's used in a practice quite a lot, that sort of merger between architecture and engineering. Since the inception of the practice, there's been this ethos of bridging arts and science and bringing architectural and engineering together. And the whole idea is that, when we're drawing something, it is not just a line on a page. There's an intentionality, there's purpose, and there's engineering thinking behind what we're trying to do. And collaboration with engineers is absolutely crucial for that. And it's where we have that sort of relationship that we then start opening up the space for innovation and for technology to kind of help us along the way and to solve lots of the complex problems that we find on our projects.
So I want to delve in a little bit into your role and sort of what is the sort of the day-to-day role of a head of sustainability? It's quite a new role. We've seen it sort of developing, but yeah, it'd be interesting sort of, what's your day-to-day and how's that developed over the years as well?
Yeah, no, it's quite varied. I see a key part of my role in sharing knowledge, increasing climate literacy in the practice, increasing an understanding of the problems that we're facing in the built environment in relation to the climate emergency, and how can we tackle them, how can we turn those issues into design responses. So I do that all levels of the practice. I really see my role as someone who has to support the teams and review the work they're doing, but also bring them inspiration and empower them to come up with their own solutions within sort of the framework and the targets that we need to achieve for sustainability. So it's quite varied. And I'd say a lot of my focus as well is in ensuring consistency, ensuring that projects across different scales and sectors are delivering to the same standard and have the same level of ambition.
It's brilliant. And I think it's something, I know WilkinsonEyre have been, active members of Architects Declare since its inception in 2019. You're heavily involved in LETI as well. Sort of how important is that sort of cross-industry collaboration?
I think that's been absolutely instrumental because it's a field that has been evolving so quickly that only by sharing knowledge with others and collaborating can we get things moving forward at the speed that we need. So my involvement in LETI and the Net Zero Carbon Building Standards and task groups for UK GBC, I'd see it as a key part of my work. And it's something that I bring to the practice as well and share with others and try and get others involved. The beauty of those groups as well is that we're trying to move faster than what legislation and sometimes the market is doing. So we're really trying to be at the forefront and try and push things forward and support the wider industry. More recently, I'm also part of a group of heads of sustainability from other architecture practices, which is a quite nice forum to just have an open and honest conversation about how we're pushing the agenda in our practices, what sort of resources are we using, what obstacles are we finding, and truly just help each other in pushing sustainability in a built environment. Yeah.
And I suppose you've got sort of various different challenges, and I suppose, you talk there a lot about the sort of challenge of making sure it's communicated internally. Tell us about some of the challenges when, you're talking to clients, especially if you're trying to build beyond standards or beyond legislation.
In some ways, we're all on a journey to understand sustainability better and understand the right levers that we can push. I believe what's quite key, either in, say, selling sustainability to a client or getting a client to go further or doing the same internally, is making sure there's a really balanced approach of understanding the basics first and understanding what the baseline is and making sure we're very confident in achieving that, and then starting to kind of introduce new things and introduce new ideas that kind of go a little bit beyond the norm, and then having that ambition to try and push further and try and be market leading, which if you look back in more recent years, there's a clear sort of market advantage and commercial advantage of being leading in sustainability. So I believe it's a no-brainer.
And we see that a lot, don't we? I suppose in the office sector in particular, especially with films like The Well Standard now, and I suppose you'll see a drive from those businesses that are becoming the lead tenants demanding work or that, their staff demanding workplaces that hit the ethos of that building matches the ethos of them as a brand and as an organization.
And that's great to see. And also the shift that you see on environmental standards being more focused on occupant perception. So well-being very focused on health and well-being of occupants and actually being connected to measured data, and the same with neighbors being connected to real energy performance, starts putting the focus more on the tenant side of things and what they get in the buildings they're occupying, which then transfers some of the responsibility as well for achieving those outcomes. But it makes a lot of sense for tenants that are forward-looking, that have committed to their own targets and have their own ESG agenda to then look for buildings that can align with their brand on that element. Yeah.
A lot of architects I've had on this podcast talked a lot about maybe how their roles are developing further from architects to actually being more sustainability consultants. And I'm interested in sort of, how you see maybe as we strive towards those net zero goals, how your role will develop further.
Yeah, I think we will be getting more technical. Even just a few years ago, there was no clear definition of what net zero exactly was for our industry and how do we get there for a particular building type. And now with the launch of the pilots, UK Net Zero Building Carbon Standard, there's a very clear definition of what there is, and becomes quite specialized, whether you're looking at embodied carbon, whether you're looking at operational energy. I think we'll see a lot of sustainability professionals that work in architecture practices having to specialize a little bit more to be able to cover those areas. So that's a move that might happen. But I think in time we'll see a bigger overlap between sustainability and innovation as well, once what we're trying to do on the more technical side becomes the norm, and then it's about kind of pushing the boundaries.
And let's talk about that actually, of innovation as well, and how that goes hand in hand with sustainability. What sort of innovations are exciting you? Where are you seeing the sort of where we need a bit more of that as well?
Yes, there's a lot happening right now, and it's a really exciting time for innovation in the built environment, particularly around things like materials. There's a very interesting return to natural materials and innovative ways of using those and kind of going around the common hurdles that you find with things like timber. For example, there's a lot of research going into being able to scale up timber. There's a lot of use of hybrid structures as well, which I find really interesting, and structural engineers are doing lots of interesting research on how to combine materials and how to take the best out of those. And in the area of circular economy as well, there's lots of research happening around material reuse and combating some of the hurdles around the recertification of materials and finding storage and matching sort of material stocks from taking from one building and going to another. So it's really exciting to see lots of little startups looking at that as well. One area that I'm very passionate about is retrofit and decarbonizing existing buildings. So on that, we've been advising a startup called Map Mortar that are coming up with a platform to decarbonize portfolios. So we've been sort of helping them out at early stage and testing their platform. And it's something that we're looking to do with other startups in that space.
I find it really interesting, the relationship with architectural practices and startups. And we have a lot, I've interviewed a lot of startups on this podcast as well. And I suppose, is there any advice that you could give them of sort of how do they, sort of become considered? And, I hear a lot from them, sort of some of their barriers to sort of, getting their product out there is, obviously being certified and testing, but it's a sort of, how do you find startups? How do you engage with them?
I think usually the startups that tend to be more successful in that space, they're looking to address a problem that's not necessarily new, but hasn't been sort of looked at with sort of angle. And they're bringing something new to a relatively old problem, and they're bringing new sort of streamlined ways of looking at that. In working with startups, what we're usually interested in, companies or groups of people that are looking at a problem that's not, sometimes it's not necessarily new, but they're looking at it with fresh eyes, and they're looking at it with a new approach that sort of streamlines the process. What we find quite valuable is as well sort of tools that help us go slightly beyond our initial remit and allow us to be a little bit more technical at the early stage. So give us sort of more data and more insights when we're starting to look at a project and we need to make sort of performance-based decisions and understand what the impact of our design measures is that's where I think a lot of the interesting innovation is coming in, is in streamlining processes and helping designers sort of make better decisions earlier.
And we talked about this before, but at WilkinsonEyre, innovation and has always been one of those key core principles, really, alongside good design and sustainability at the heart. How do you keep those principles guiding the projects that you're working on?
Yeah, as a practice, we seem to thrive in solving complex problems that need collaboration across disciplines, and that needs everyone to be pulling in the same direction. And and in some cases, you do get stuck solving those problems, and a spark of innovation is needed. So we try and push our engineers to do their best work and to come up with innovative solutions for problems, to have a little bit of lateral thinking, and in return we're expecting the same. We're expecting them to push us to do something different, to kind of come up with new ways of looking at problems. So I think it's in that space that innovation tends to happen in our projects. Yeah.
And so how do you ensure that that discipline, that alignment, I suppose, across all of those disciplines? Is that the modern role of the architect?
Yes, I'd say the architect has always been seen as kind of, a lead of the design team, carrying that design vision from the client alongside project management and the client team. So I think it's quite important that architects continue to upskill in the various technical areas that are developing, being building safety, being sustainability, being advancements in materials and structural design, to be able to have just enough knowledge to drive those areas forward, understand very well what's coming from the other side, and being able to integrate that as kind of a guardian of the design vision, if that makes sense. So almost going back to that old idea of the architect as the master builder, who kind of understands all the trades.
So we had Mina Hassman on that, and also Dipti Ravi, that I know and we talked a lot about, I think, almost with this move to now better, well-performing buildings, where does the role of good design sit as well? And we talked a lot about maybe you wouldn't be able to design some of the sort of the glass facade offices that we have now that sort of are probably still iconic landmarks of the London skyline. Where do you see that that balancing act between creativity and functionality, and maybe going in the future?
Yeah, I think that tension definitely has to exist, but it's essential to delivering good design. I don't see the two things as being separate necessarily. What you can trace back, for example, to our bridge work is that sort of intentionality of the form of a building. It's in fact a balancing act between creativity and functionality. I think that tension sort of has to exist, and it is healthy in design. And if you look at bridges, you see an example of something where functionality can be quite beautiful and quite appealing. So we try and strive that balance as much as we can on our project.
And actually, I'd love to come on to some of the projects that you're currently working on. And I know one that's quite high profile is in Canary Wharf, is the City Tower. And that's going to be probably a benchmark in retrofitting. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so that's ongoing. Yeah, it's a great project, and we're really, really happy to be working on it. And once it's completed, I think there'll be lots of good lessons learned and good stories that can be implemented across retrofit of other large scale projects, and hopefully will become a benchmark for doing that. I think the key decision on that project that saved around 100,000 tons of CO2 was just to decide keep the building structure. So by doing that, then is what do you do next? How do you bring the building up to standard? So it's having a major overhaul of the building services, with replacing the M&E kit and bringing that up to standard. In terms of the facades, it's a very interesting story, because we found that lots of the facade was actually in good condition and could stay for another few years. So we've decided to focus on very strategic interventions at low level, middle of the building and top of the building, to then create more amenity focused areas where we replace the facade to improve the connection to the exterior, and make those areas really about having more greenery, having more connection to nature, more access to daylight, having those areas naturally ventilated. So we've been a bit more sort of strategic and replaced the facades just on just on those areas as a starting point. A lot of the work we're doing on that building as well is kind of improving the connectivity and moving it from being a building with mostly trading floors to creating vertical villages where there's more organic movement between groups of floors and kind of punching holes between them and creating those really sort of lively little neighborhoods, which starts aligning more with what you see in modern office spaces and new ways of working and what people expect from an office.
That's really interesting, because you're absolutely right. You know, that was a building that was synonymous with trading floors, which probably had a standardized floor plate and, you know, probably open plan, but a lot of boxes as well. So sort of doing that, does that pose some real engineering problems or, you know, challenges?
Yeah, it definitely does, and it was through sort of collaborating with engineer that we found the right places to create those holes and how the structure gets reinforced to sort of facilitate that and being really strategic about those moves. Yes.
And where does that sort of connectivity, where's that being driven from? Is that sort of at client level? Is that sort of developer level? Or is that all the way down?
It's all the way down, and it's also informed by principles around health and well-being, where we're interested to create more human interaction in a building, foster movement, to kind of have a more human experience that's just not kind of, you know, running back to the core, taking a lift up and down. It's, you know, a little bit more organic, a little bit more natural, really.
Brilliant. Well, hopefully maybe get you on in a couple of years' time, and we can talk more about how that project, some of the key learnings from that. Another project, you know, which is probably synonymous with the London skyline is 8 Bishopsgate, which is actually London's tallest building with a BREEAM outstanding. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and some of the main challenges in embedding sustainability, you know, at that scale posed?
Sure, BREEAM. Yeah, just going back a little bit about BREEAM. BREEAM's been absolutely instrumental in pushing sustainability and creating a good baseline when it came through. But I feel like nowadays it's getting slightly behind other more performance-based targets that are looking more at outcomes. So things like WELL and neighbors and other net zero building standards. But it's still, you know, achieving BREEAM outstanding is still a lot of work, and particularly on a project that's spanning these many years, like making sure that the initial ambition of achieving that is maintained throughout the design process is quite an achievement. So what we had on that particular project to make sure we got to that level of performance was to focus on the facade. So the facade is a closed cavity facade with automated blinds that reacts to the external conditions and mitigates solar gain. So that has a huge impact in reducing cooling loads. The M&E services are sort of distributed by floor. So there's on-floor plants that allows us a lot more control over how much air is delivered to each floor, making things a lot more efficient. The heat pumps sort of recovering heat from the cooling cycle and putting that back into hot water. There's grey water recycling. I mean, there's lots of good stuff happening there, which is not always common to see on a building of that scale. So we're really happy that, you know, lots of those elements managed to come together.
I think you have a really unique opportunity, don't you, or sort of challenge at WilkinsonEyre, that you're working on buildings of huge scale, but at the same time trying to implement, you know, those sustainability measures as well, which poses the challenges. You know, one of the big key challenges I think with tall buildings is obviously the amount of embodied carbon that goes into them as well. How do you address things like that?
What's really interesting about this particular project is because of its program, we're in the middle of the design stages when sort of the first methodologies and sort of calculation methods were coming through for addressing embodied carbon. So we found that it was actually a great opportunity to use that as a way to quantifying what we were trying to do around structural efficiency. So we know that, you know, tall buildings carry a premium. They need slightly more structure than something that's mid-rise, and they need more amenities to sort of work at that height. So what we've done was, through collaboration with the structural engineer, we found solutions to make sure that every structural element was just exactly the right size that it needed to be, which is not something you see very commonly. It's more common to sort of apply the same beam sizes across a building for standardization, but we really wanted to take that right sizing approach, which ended up saving 5,000 tons of CO2 in the process and making the building about 20-30% lighter than a typical building of that size. So it was a real process of optimization of trying to make the building as light as possible. Something that you see as well when you walk around the building is that, well, the structural bracing is visible, so the lateral stability system is visible, but it's somehow in the middle of the building, it's not there anymore because it doesn't need to be. Whereas in a lot of cases, what it tends to do, like the architectural intuition, is just to kind of continue to extend that and make that a feature, but we wanted to keep that as light as possible.
So that comes back to that sort of aesthetics versus functionality. Yeah. And I think I think you're right. I think a big drive at the moment is to do more with less. Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit about material reuse, but also just reducing the amount of materials that we're using can have a huge impact. I'm sort of interested then in sort of your circularity principles. We talk a lot at the moment about circularity, but it's a concept that's been around for many years, but I think it's coming at the forefront now. Can you tell us about maybe some projects that you've worked on where sort of circularity has been at the heart of things?
One project that quite interestingly used a lot of circularity principles when it was done at the time was the basketball arena that we've done for the London Olympics. So it was designed for disassembly, which is one of the key circular economy principles. So our work in the sports sector has sort of informed how we look at that, and the idea of doing more with less, as you were saying, and the idea of being able to adapt the function of something, dismantle a building if necessary, kind of make sure that the materials are fit for reuse elsewhere are principles that are part of design sort of ethos. On more recent projects, what we're trying to explore more and more is around that sort of theme of retaining structures. We're trying to do that with as less intervention as we can. So building for the LSBU University, so the LSBU hub, where we've done a retrofit of the London Road building, actually got an award for minimal structural intervention, which is something that we were quite happy with because it meant that, through very strategic just reinforcement of the structure where it needed to be with carbon reinforced fibers and sort of clever interventions like that, we were able to, use just the right amount of material. And you sort of see that on more recent projects that we're working on, particularly in the city, and things that we're now kind of working to planning, where we are at the earliest stages looking at whole life carbon optioneering. It's something that we're doing in-house and creating workflows for that, so we can have informed decisions about whether to keep a building, how much we can extend it by, and how that pans out in terms of carbon. So that's really kind of informing our approach, and getting those basics right then allows us some space to start looking at things like taking stone out of the building, crushing it, putting it back into a facade panel, and bringing it back into the new building. And then, really starting to streamline those stories of material reuse where we can.
Mm. And I think you're right. It was really interesting you brought up the sort of the 2012 Olympics, because I think that whole reuse story probably hasn't been lauded or told enough. And I think you think back to sort of some of the other Olympic cities that you see, the derelict stadiums, and London, it was a real triumph in the amount of reuse. And actually some of those buildings, like obviously the stadium and the aquatic centre, have become iconic buildings now of London. I suppose one of the advantages of your role is that you work on some of the biggest marquee projects, but at the same time, then you've probably got a lot of pressure to try and sort of showcase and share a lot of that learning. And I suppose scaling sustainability, I think, probably is still one of our biggest challenges, across the built environment. So, sort of, what strategies do you think we should be doing to maybe more effectively embed those, that sustainability within our projects?
Yeah. So as an industry, we've been evolving and we've been learning a lot about the environmental impact of what we're doing. And even just recently, there was some research around the biodiversity impact of material extraction, for example, and how the decisions we're doing to minimize embodied carbon might have an impact in biodiversity elsewhere. And we're constantly learning and evolving our approach to respond to that. We need to continue to gather more data about how our buildings are performing, and we need to continue to be increasingly more transparent about sharing data across the industry to increase our common understanding of the issues and how do we tackle them. I think that's the way to scale up, and collaborating with others, sharing knowledge, being able to communicate the successes but also the failures of your projects to enable others to learn. That's how you really start getting more consistency across the industry and are able to scale up.
Yeah, you've talked a little bit about your sort of meeting planning regs, and a lot of the sort of the innovation and sustainability you pull in is probably driven by the local authorities. And I think Labour are now talking about more devolution, of power, in that sense. What do you see the role of a local authority in sort of driving change in the built environment?
I think local authorities are absolutely crucial. And if you look back to 2019, 2020, when a lot of the local authorities were actually the first to come forward and say, there's a climate emergency, we're going to do something about it. We're going to start updating our plans. We're going to look at ways in how we can get to net zero at a local scale. But then obviously there's the obstacle that there's only so much they can do within the planning framework and within the legislation. So things like Part L, for example, is the absolute baseline minimum, but most projects are going much beyond that. So I think we need more space for local authorities to kind of push their agendas forward. If they're truly interested in achieving more in decarbonization and striving for net zero, I think they should be empowered to further in that. But I believe we also need a push at national level to bring that baseline up to be able to have more consistency across the industry. So basically to raise that minimum standard. Yeah, there's some interesting initiatives as well now around the Climate and Nature Act, which is going to be in Parliament soon. I think that's again a huge opportunity to have something that's in law with strong commitments at national level to do better in terms of sustainability and to really come up with a strong strategy for tackling the climate emergency and the nature emergency in sort of a combined way. So I think it's really crucial that we're involved in that level as well, and that we do what we can to campaign for those things to happen.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think as an industry, sometimes we say, we don't want more red tape, we don't want more legislation, but at the same time, you're absolutely right. We seem to only build to compliance levels, and actually, we need to be going beyond that. I think things like the Passive House Standard have shown, that that's where we should be building to reduce our energy usage, make more thermally efficient homes, or buildings, in that sense. And then you've got the Net Zero Building Standard, obviously coming through, as well.
I think that there's a balance to be found there. I don't think we necessarily need very prescriptive standards that are saying exactly how much insulation should a wall have or what heating system you should have. I think we've had examples in the past where there was a big push for example, biomass boilers and for CHP, which turned up to not necessarily be the right answer in the long term. So I think we need more performance-based standards that tell us where we actually need to be in relation to the budget, the carbon budget that we have for buildings and cities, and stick to those.
I can't not ask you a question. I think being a building service engineer, it's interesting you mentioned there around, different funding or things. Obviously, there's a big push on heat pumps at the moment. That's where the government funding sits. If you went back a couple of years, the talk was all about hydrogen. Where do you see our sort of our energy generation moving to, and what would you like to see from the government to drive that forward?
Yes, it's very clear that we need to continue to decarbonize the grid, bringing more renewables, and there's positive moves around onshore wind, for example, and large scale solar. So we definitely need that infrastructure to become greener. But I think sometimes we get a little bit lost looking for a technological solution, whether it's going to be hydrogen or whether it's going to be heat pumps or something else. And sometimes we tend to forget the basics, which is, we need airtight, well-insulated buildings that actually reduce the demand. We need to be metering our buildings properly and understanding how much energy they're using and taking action to reduce that before we sort of get to carry the way with which technology is going to solve the problem for us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think an area that you've been doing a lot of development on maybe is facades in particular, and you see that as a sort of a key area for achieving that net zero goals. Sort of tell us a little bit about that and how you maybe see sort of facade design evolving over the years.
Yeah, I believe there's a consistent move now away from that international style that we saw in the 20th century and start of this century as well, where you'd see a glazed facade anywhere in the world. They're all look the same. I always found it a bit confusing why they're not responding to the local climate, why they're not taking inspiration from vernacular architecture, why they're not using local materials. So I think we're at the stage now where there's more of an understanding that doesn't necessarily work, and that means we get buildings that don't perform as well as they should. So it's really exciting to see facades becoming a little bit more responsive. You start seeing even around the city facades being slightly more opaque, being slightly different per orientation and more responsive to the context. So then the challenge for us becomes, how do you deliver that? How do you make those facades light enough? How do you choose the right material for those opaque areas? So it's all kind of things that we're working through and trying to get a better understanding of.
Are we seeing a resurgence towards sort of natural building products, and particularly natural stone on facades as well?
I believe so. And I think stone has been an overlooked material to a certain extent, and it's great to see it sort of making some sort of comeback. What I'd be very interested to see as well is stone being used more as a structural material. You start to see small examples of reinforced stone, for example. Starting to see more of that rather than just decorative stone. I think that's where a lot of the innovation could also happen is reinterpretation of those natural materials that we've been working with for years and years.
There's a big reuse story there, but also there's a sort of a lot of quite usable stone left in our quarries as well. So it ticks a lot of sustainability boxes.
Definitely, and we owe it to that carbon and labor and cost that was put into building those buildings to then reuse those materials and give them a new lease of life.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. We always sort of finish the podcast with a few questions around sort of looking ahead, but also maybe sort of what advice you would give a young, whether that's civil engineer or building survey engineer or even architect, sort of starting out and sort of wanting to enter the sort of field of sustainable design.
Please do it. We need more. There's still a skills gap, and there's still a shortage of professionals in our fields and professionals in adjacent fields that understand not only the challenges of sustainability, but how do you actually come up with solutions for the problems. What sort of advice I would give? I think, this is quite generic advice I would give to anyone, but I think just being open and being curious, asking questions, learning as much as you can from others in your industry, so you're able to kind of push for designs that are not only focusing on sustainability, but delivering on other aspects. I think we're at the stage where if we want to make real change, sort of every job needs to be a sustainability job in a way. So I think it's a responsibility for us that are specialized in this subject to sort of inspire, bring others on the journey with us and bring that enthusiasm to the table.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's sort of, on paper, it's sort of, the built environment is such an exciting place. We've talked a lot about, innovations, the amazing innovations that are coming through. We're part of, a big driver towards net zero. That's an exciting place to be, especially, the youth of today are very environmentally conscious. Yeah. It almost seems like the ultimate job, but we don't seem to be able to attract the talent.
It's Yeah, it's strange in a way. I feel like it will change gradually, but it's a very slow moving industry. I believe that's not always particularly appealing to young people when you think that, you know, the result of your work will probably take 10, 15 years to come into fruition. It's not always kind of aligned with the idea of getting, you know, feedback on what you're doing and getting that sort of recognition. But I would say that will change with the advancements in technology and the way that we are, you know, improving our workflows and looking at new ways of designing buildings. I think that will continue to attract young people. And if you think about, for example, the impact of the construction industry, which is responsible for about 40% of the emissions, it's definitely a very good place to be if you want to make an impact on the environment.
Absolutely. Plus, you know, the amount of waste we send to landfill as well. So you're absolutely right. It's interesting you mentioned impact there. You know, that's the theme of Futurebuild this year, is around how we create a positive impact in the built environment. I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball question. I'd love to just sort of hear around maybe some people throughout your career have had a real positive impact on you. We love sort of talking about other people.
Yes.
On this podcast.
Yeah, I'd say my journey in getting involved in Letty 2017 and supporting the group in various bits of work has been really inspirational and has given me the enthusiasm to continue to push for advancing sustainability in the workplace and in the projects that I've been involved in throughout the year. So rather than, you know, necessarily nominating someone, I think, you know, just the amount of enthusiasm and the amount of talent and the people involved in Letty has been truly inspirational throughout my career.
I mean, it's a great example. They're an amazing collective, and I think, you know, it amazes me the amount that of time people volunteer to them, but also the outputs on minimal budgets as well. It's absolutely amazing, you know, and there's multiple groups like that across the built environment, which is really inspirational to see. We're going to finish. I think we talked about this WilkinsonEyre 40 years of sort of legacy and sustainability and leading in that. You know, can you tell us a little bit maybe about how they're going to plan to continue leading the way in sustainable architecture?
Yes. Well, we've launched our sustainability manifesto a few years ago, which reflected upon our journey and achievements on environmental design and sustainability on our projects, but also created very clear targets for where we wanted to be and where we wanted to improve and where we wanted to have a positive impact. Now we're at a time where we're reflecting upon that. We're trying to understand, you know, just how many projects we were able to have as much impact as we wanted, taking lessons learned from that and charting our way forward and looking at, you know, how do we get to net zero as an organization? How do we make sure the vast majority of our projects are also working to net zero, but not just focusing on that as one output, but trying to still deliver to a very high level on things like biodiversity, health and well-being, and other aspects of sustainability, social value, community, and all of those things. So we're at the process where we're trying to come up with what that strategy is going to be, and we want to be as ambitious as possible, so we can sort of be inspired and push each other internally, push our clients, push our collaborators, and have a good impact. Fantastic.
My final question, I suppose, is what's going to excite you most about the future of design?
Yeah, like we were talking about before, I think it's a really good place to be in terms of innovation and in terms of all the good things that are happening around materials, around technology, and how that's facilitating achieving the ambitious targets that we are setting on projects. I think there's a huge role for young professionals to come through and bring their ideas, and it's our role to empower them and give them space to thrive and bring that innovation forward. So, you know, who knows what the next few years bring, but we want to keep the same level of ambition and the same commitment to delivering to our sustainability outcomes.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.